As you know, every week or two, I bring in an expert in cybersecurity to talk about his or hers perspective on careers in the cybersecurity field. And this morning, I'm really happy to have Gary Kessler, a longtime leader and thought leader and expert, and a person who's accomplished a huge amount in cybersecurity. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much.
And what especially prompted this conversation is Gary just published a book on maritime security. And I think if you're like me, a lot of people, we don't think too much about maritime cybersecurity. But on the other hand, it is part of our critical infrastructure, and it is something that is at risk for cyber attacks. But so before we get into that, though, Gary, could you tell us a little bit about what you're doing now? You have your own company, and just kind of give a thumbnail sketch of your background and what you're doing these days.
Well, I got involved with cybersecurity, although we called it information security back then, in the late 1970s, just about the time I was in grad school. And so I've been engaged one way or another as I've done other things in my career, primarily focusing for a while on data communications and telecommunications. I spent a lot of years in the early, 2000 century doing digital forensics and working a lot with law enforcement, supporting investigations into internet facilitated crimes against children. But I never really lost my focus on cyber. And also in that time, I'm a scuba instructor with a captain's license. So I've got a very strong interest in maritime. And so for the last few years, that's really where I've been focusing a lot of my research energies and a lot of my writing energies. So I'm about to retire as a professor of cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. So I do have my own little company where I do some consulting and research and white papers and that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's where I am.
Very cool. And so in terms of maritime, so I had not personally thought too much about that as a kind of landing space for people with cybersecurity degrees, undergrad or grad. So lay out kind of the landscape there. What kind of risks do we have, and do you see it as a good destination for people trying to get into the field, or is it too specialized, or do you need maritime background to get into the field, or where, I guess, big picture, where are the risks in that
Yeah.
particular field from a cyber point of view?
Well, as you know, transportation sector is one of the critical infrastructures identified by DHS, and certainly aviation, maritime, rail are three big areas underneath the transportation sector. Maritime's interesting because, on the one hand, well, first of all, when you think about maritime, I like people to think about this broadly. Most people, when you talk about maritime, the first thing they think of is, oh yeah, ships and ports. But maritime, the transportation sector, think about it a little bit more broadly than that. So one of the things that I like to remind people is that the United States really is a maritime nation. Roughly 90% of our imports and exports come by sea. So the criticalness of maritime to our society and our economy is, incredible. But when you think about maritime, it is, of course, ships and ports, but it's also the shipping lines. We have manufacturing, so we have to worry about intellectual property. We've got the companies themselves. So in maritime, we have the same cybersecurity threats that everybody else has in dealing with everything else. For example, in 2020 already, there have been, I believe, 5 well-advertised ransomware attacks that have hit the maritime industry. We have to worry about phishing. We have to worry about hacks into our data systems. And so that's the same kind of cybersecurity 101 that everybody else needs. Now, having said that, maritime has its own specific risks because we have our own specific systems. So the navigation systems and communication systems that we use on board vessels, the traffic management systems that are used in ports to manage where ships are and where they're going, So we have our own uniqueness because of our own unique systems, but globally the problems are pretty much the same as everywhere else.
Interesting. So one thing about cybersecurity is a good practice is always to understand the business that you're in, right? So as
Yeah.
opposed to just throwing cybersecurity regulations up there. But is there a ecosystem of vendors that supports the maritime industry as you've described it, or is it the same security vendors that supports every other industry? So if you wanted to participate in that industry, do you have to look for certain supporting vendors if you wanted to work on the vendor side?
It's a little bit of both. There are a lot of companies that do cyber across the board. In the last couple of years, there have been a number that have started to focus just on maritime because I think that we've realized that maritime is its own subspecialty. And quite frankly, companies are realizing that there's money to be made by focusing on that.
Okay, and just sort of talking a little more about careers in that area, is there a lot of people, or at least some of our students and some of the people in our program have strong computer science backgrounds, so they're kind of in the software engineering area, coding, that kind of thing. Do you see that are there opportunities in the maritime cybersecurity field there, or are they kind of the same as other industries?
Well, again, I think it would be the same, myriad opportunities. Certainly, computer science backgrounds and software engineering backgrounds are important um, in the cybersecurity realm. On the other hand, I also think that there are some non CS and software engineering skills that are necessary. I mean, my background academically is in mathematics and computer science. But what I've come to understand and believe in the last 20, 25 years is that, even though I can, sit down and write code when I need to and whip out my soldering iron to show my credentials, you need to understand the business practices and you need to understand people. And so cybersecurity, or more importantly in this context, cyber defense is not strictly a computer science function. And I actually think that one of the errors that we make is that a lot of companies put the cybersecurity and cyber defense function underneath the information technology group. And I think that IT has its own job to do, architecting a secure network, if you will. But cybersecurity is different in the fact that they're dealing with the policies and the procedures, adherence to regulation, again, management of personnel and the assets. And so I see the chief information officer and the chief information security officer as having to be peers. And therefore, I view the work as having to be, in that regard, peers as well. And so, again, a techie background, if you have a notion of doing some things that are potentially quasi non-techie, needing a technical understanding, but you're not going to be writing code every day. Um, and so, like I said, there's a place for everybody in the game. As we all know, there are, how many million cybersecurity jobs that are going to be available?
Mhm.
We don't have enough people to fill them. And the cybersecurity problems are just getting worse. Maritime is interesting, I think. I'll give you a quote that came out of a maritime CEO meeting a couple of years ago, where one of the CEOs observed that maritime is anywhere between 30 and 500 years behind in technology. Well, there's not many industries in the world that can be 500 years behind in anything. But the fact is, if you look at a bill of lading on a vessel today, it looks suspiciously similar to a bill of lading you could have found in 1500. The automation of systems in maritime frequently is taking the old way of doing things and applying a computer to it so we can do it better, faster, and more accurate. They're not necessarily changing information flows. So there's incredible opportunity, I think, in maritime. And personally, I find it to be a fascinating space to be in.
Yeah, that's so many good points there. I completely agree. It's sort of having security report into IT sort of perpetuates this myth, that technology is going to solve the problem. That's a big disaster. But you also mentioned certifications and things like that. So are there like industry certifications in the maritime world that firms operating there have to meet? I don't know if any on cybersecurity come to mind. And then also beyond, there's obviously the CISSP. Are there industry specific certifications that people could get, or are there ones that come to mind that would be especially valuable, like forensics, or if you wanted to move into this field, what cert should you have on your resume? My next question is going to be, what meetings, let's say you want to learn more about this field. I know there are no face-to-face meetings, but are there conferences or publications? But
there are a number of publications.
Mm-hmm.
There's no publication that I'm aware of that is specific to maritime cyber, but there are a number of maritime publications that certainly are soliciting cyber types of articles.
Yeah.
Interestingly, you asked the question about meetings. This very week is the Maritime Risk Symposium, which happens around October-ish every year. And indeed, this year is a very virtual meeting. There are meetings like Ports of the Future, and so there are a variety of meetings. With respect to certification, it's interesting that you asked that question. At this moment, there is not a maritime-specific cybersecurity certification, although I would not be surprised to see one happening within the next, 6 months. Something like the CISSP is certainly a good certification to have, certainly showing practice. Like many of the certifications, SANS, Security Plus, all of those things, they are generic to aspects of information security and cybersecurity, but not yet focused on the maritime. And so, if I was a company that was if I was a maritime company looking to hire a cyber person, I would certainly go get anybody that knew about cyber, and I could teach them what they need to know about the maritime. And generally, that's that's sort of the flow that would happen. Most organizations are hiring a cybersecurity professional, and then over whatever time it takes them, they learn about the specifics of the business. And in a lot of ways, the knowledge is transferable from one sector to another, although again, maritime has its own uniqueness.
Right. The fact that you said the technology is relatively behind certainly creates a lot of opportunities. It may be slow moving, but a lot of opportunities for new technology. And once there's new technology, there are more cybersecurity risks and things of that nature. So,
well, I'll tell the two biggest areas right now in maritime that are brand new, that are hot, anything with operational technology, industrial control systems, that kind of stuff, and more autonomy. Those are the big areas, big directions that we're moving in.
By autonomy, you mean automation, or what do you mean by that?
Autonomous vessels.
Oh, self-driving vessels. Wow. Okay.
There's a lot of projects going on right now in having fully autonomous vessels.
Fascinating. And so what I hear is that there's no one conference on maritime cybersecurity. It's covered in a lot of different. Is there a website that people could go to keep up with this? Like, do you keep up to date on your website with events and stuff like that? Or that's your website would be one resource. It's a .net, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I try to keep a little bit up to date on mine. There are a number of organizations that try to maintain that as well. There is the Maritime and Port Security Information Security and Analysis Organization, the MPS-ISAO. There's the Maritime Transportation Sector Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the MTS-ISAC. There are a ton of newsletters. I actually have a number of links to those on my website. a number of newsletters that come out about maritime issues in general, and they will frequently have articles on maritime security and or maritime cybersecurity. But there's not yet just one focused. And it would be sort of difficult to have one that was so totally focused on maritime cyber because of all the other things that are going on around what makes it a cyber issue. Coast Guard certainly puts out their bulletins. So there are a lot of players.
Interesting. You mentioned that if I remember right, you're teaching a course on this, right?
I am.
What are the topics that you're covering in that? So.
Well, again, general overview of what the maritime transportation sector is, and then spending, specific time on some of the better known cyber events that have occurred, just the maritime industry in general, specifics on ports, some specifics on shipping lines, shipboard networks themselves. One of the biggest areas of concern right now, not just within maritime, but from without as well, is attacks on GPS and other navigation systems, industrial control systems and autonomy, as I just mentioned. But then after, spending a lot of time bringing people down about all the risks about maritime, I have to spend a little bit of time bringing them back up to the surface and saying, it's not all gloom and doom. There are guidelines for how to deal with this. Any number of organizations have put out guidance, not the least of which is the NIST framework. U.S. Coast Guard obviously is very active in this as well, trying to come up with guidance, International Maritime Organization, and then just other resources on which to, gain information about this.
Yeah. So let's say you were in the shoes of a student studying cybersecurity. And maybe you had an interest in this field. What steps would you take to start looking for a position or prepare yourself? Anything different? I mean, you want to get some certifications. What do you have any thoughts about how to get your foot in the door in this field, or based on all your besides
this is gonna
license?
Yeah, well, getting captain's license was that took some time. So without sounding too self-serving, one of the reasons that my co-author and I wrote our book about maritime cyber was that there was what we felt to be a gap in the literature about what is maritime cybersecurity. There are many articles that have been written. I've written a couple myself, but we wanted to provide that resource. It was essentially really for leaders and managers, but obviously could be for students as well, saying, okay, I've heard about this maritime cyber, what is it? And just get a broad brush overview, but then at the same time, introduce the reader to, well, who are the players? And, where are the regulations and the guidelines coming from? And in some ways, in general, I would always say to a student, go get a book. Like I said, it's a little self-serving to say, go get my book, but get a book. It'll give you a broad brush. You'll find out, oh, this strikes me as really interesting. This strikes me as not so interesting, which is the same as you'll find, in any other field. And it also gives some starting points of where to go. I think a newly graduating student would have a difficult time getting a CISSP because of the experiential requirement. But I think right now, gaining the right knowledge and the right perspective. And, I haven't seen anybody not get a job because they didn't have a certification. Certainly not coming right out of school.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I have the book, as you know. I think it's very good. And I think that's good advice, because you can always go to everybody says, go out, work your network, go out to LinkedIn, find who's looking for people. But I think one of the key things you would get out of reading a book like this is you can start talking the talk. You can't talk to these people about opportunities in cyber if you have no clue what's out there. So if you've read it, you're going to sound like you know what you're doing, and I think that will certainly help you get a foot in the door.
If you refer to the floor of the boat, yeah, they'll know you're a newbie.
Thanks so much, Gary, for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks to everybody who's listening. I hope this information is useful, and take a look. On a couple of weeks, we'll have another interview with a thought leader. And Gary, have a great rest of the day, and the same to everybody else who's listening.
Thanks, Fred.